Seconds before I accepted the promotion, my mentor grabbed my arm and whispered, "Resign instead. Right now." I quit on the spot, stunning the entire room. What the police discovered in my office that afternoon explained everything. The conference room on the 14th floor of Hargrove and Lund Financial Services smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. And I had been standing at the head of the table for exactly 11 seconds when Conrad Halsey's hand closed around my left forearm with the quiet urgency of a man who has just seen something catch fire. The room held 14 people. My direct supervisor, Regional Director Philip Okafor, sat at the center of the long mahogany table with a leather portfolio open in front of him and an expression calibrated to project warmth while also communicating authority. Almer, the expression of a man who had practiced this moment in a mirror. The company's chief operating officer, a woman named Diana Rest, who had flown in from the Chicago headquarters specifically for this announcement, sat to his left in a charcoal blazer, a glass of water untouched in front of her. Around them sat the 7 members of the regional leadership team, 2 representatives from HR, a communications specialist named B. Dunbar, who I recognized from the company internet photo, and my 2 closest colleagues in the investment analytics division, Kwame Asante and Nadia Volkov, both of whom were smiling at me with the particular smile of people who are genuinely happy for a friend, and also deeply curious what this means for their own trajectory. I was 34 years old. I had been with Hargrove and Lund for 6 years. I had been told, and 40 minutes prior in a brief private conversation with Philip in his office, that I was being promoted to Vice President of Analytics for the Eastern Region, a position that came with a $94,000 salary increase, an equity package, a relocation allowance to the Chicago headquarters, and a team of 22 analysts reporting directly to me. It was, by any reasonable measure, the moment my career had been building toward since I'd graduated from Georgetown with an economics degree and a minor in applied mathematics, and walked into my first job at a mid-tier consulting firm with 2 suits and $3,400 in my checking account. It was the moment I was supposed to say yes. Conrad Halsey's hand was on my arm. His voice was barely a breath. Resign. Right now. And I knew Conrad well enough to know that he had never once said anything without meaning exactly and completely what he said. I had been working at Hargrove and Lund for 6 years and 3 months when that conference room moment happened. And in those 6 years, I had built what I considered to be a clean and well-documented record of professional competence. My name was Elliot Osei-Bonsu. I was the son of a Ghanaian civil engineer and a Nigerian-American schoolteacher who had raised me in Silver Spring, Maryland, with a specific and consistent emphasis on the value of doing the work correctly the first time and not cutting corners, because corners have a way of becoming walls. I had taken that philosophy seriously. I documented everything. I kept meticulous records. I arrived early and stayed late, not because I was trying to impress anyone, but because I was genuinely interested in the work, which was financial data analytics, specifically the modeling and interpretation of risk exposure in mid-market investment portfolios. It was not glamorous work in the way that, say, managing client relationships or closing deals was glamorous, but it was the kind of work that mattered quietly and significantly, the kind that kept a financial firm from making catastrophic errors that would only become visible years later when the dominoes fell and everyone looked around asking who had signed off on the models. I had a reputation for being the person who caught things. Not dramatically, not by raising alarms or sending all caps emails, just by doing the work correctly and noting, in precise and documented language, to when something in the data did not align with what the models were supposed to show. This reputation had, over 6 years, earned me the trust of the regional leadership team and, more importantly, the mentorship of Conrad Halsey. Conrad Halsey was 61 years old, the former chief risk officer of Hargrove and Lund's Eastern operations, who had retired from active executive leadership 3 years earlier and had accepted a consulting and mentorship role within the firm's talent development program. He was a tall, spare man with gray hair cut close to his skull and reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead with the absent-mindedness of someone who had owned reading glasses for so long he no longer really saw them. He had spent 31 years in financial risk analysis. He had testified before the Senate Banking Committee twice on matters related to systemic risk in investment markets and had a manner of speaking that was unhurried and precise in a way that made you feel, when he spoke directly to you, that whatever you were discussing was the only thing in the world worth discussing at that moment. He had taken an interest in my work 2 years into my tenure at Hargrove and Lund when I had flagged an anomaly in the firm's regional portfolio exposure, reporting that turned out, upon further investigation, to be a documentation error that had been compounding quietly for 14 months, and which, if left unaddressed, would have created a material misrepresentation in the firm's quarterly risk disclosure. Conrad had called me into his office, then still the executive suite on the 14th floor, and asked me to walk him through my analysis. I had done so. He had listened without interrupting. When I finished, he had said, "You found this by doing the work the way the work is supposed to be done." He had asked if I had a mentor. I said no. He said, "You do now." That had been 4 years ago. And in those 4 years, Conrad had become the person I trusted most within the professional structure of my life, which was a significant thing given that I am not, by temperament, a person who distributes trust easily. I need to tell you about the 6 months before the promotion announcement, because that is where the story actually begins, though I didn't understand that until much later. The firm had undergone a significant internal restructuring in the previous fiscal year, or reorganizing the Eastern Region's Analytics Division under new departmental leadership. The restructuring had brought in several new hires at the senior level, most notably a man named Gareth Stoll, who had been appointed as Senior Director of Investment Analytics, which was the role directly above mine and directly below the Vice President position I was now being considered for. Gareth was 42 years old, well-dressed in the self-conscious way of someone who had read that presentation mattered and had applied that lesson with enthusiasm, and he had an impressive resume that included stints at 2 major investment banks and an MBA from Wharton. He was smart, fluent in the language of financial strategy, and extremely good at being in rooms with important people. He was also, what I had come to understand over 18 months of working alongside him, someone who had a very specific relationship with the work product of the people beneath him. Gareth did not steal credit in the crude and obvious way that makes a workplace villain immediately legible. He did it with surgical precision, through the careful management of information flow, the selective attribution of insights in senior meetings, and the practice of inserting himself between analysts and leadership in ways that ensured leadership's understanding of any given piece of work was always filtered through Gareth's framing of it. My work, specifically, had a way of appearing in Gareth's presentations with his name on the methodology slides. Not always. Not completely. But consistently enough that I had noticed. And consistently enough that I had started keeping records, which was what I did when I noticed things. The first specific incident that I documented occurred in November, 7 months before the promotion announcement. I had completed a comprehensive risk exposure analysis of the firm's mid-market municipal bond portfolio, a project that had taken me 6 weeks and involved developing a new stress testing framework that accounted for regional economic indicators in ways the existing model did not. It was, without excessive modesty, genuinely good work. I had presented a preliminary version to Gareth in a one-on-one review meeting and had emailed him the complete methodology document and the underlying spreadsheet models the following day. 3 weeks later, at a regional leadership meeting I was not present for, Gareth presented the findings to the senior team. I know this because Kwame was in that meeting as a note-taker, and because I later obtained the meeting minutes through the firm's internal documentation system, which was routine and accessible to all team members. In the minutes, the risk exposure analysis was attributed to the analytics division under Gareth's leadership with no individual attribution. The methodology was described in language that was almost verbatim from my original documentation. I had noted this in my records. I had not said anything to Gareth directly, because I was waiting to understand whether this was a pattern or an isolated oversight. It was a pattern. I documented 3 more similar incidents over the following 5 months, each one carefully noted with dates, document names, email timestamps, and whatever meeting record I could access. By the time the promotion announcement was being prepared, I had a folder on my personal hard drive labeled simply HL Documentation containing 32 files. The second thing I need to tell you about those 6 months concerns something I had noticed in the data itself, which was separate from the credit attribution issue and considerably more serious. In March, 4 months before the promotion announcement, I was conducting a routine audit review of the Analytics Division's model validation logs, a quarterly administrative task that was part of my responsibilities as senior analyst. The validation logs were records of the internal testing and review processes applied to the models we used for portfolio risk assessment before those models were used to generate reports. Standard procedure required that any significant modification to a model's parameters or assumptions be logged, reviewed by a second analyst, and approved by the senior director before the modified model was used in live reporting. The logs I was reviewing showed a clean and untroubled record of compliance with this procedure. Everything properly logged, properly reviewed, properly approved. Gareth's signature on the approval lines. All neat. All documented. All completely consistent with the expectation that everything had been done correctly. Except one model, the one designated HL-ERM-9, which was used to calculate exposure concentration limits for the Eastern Region's equity portfolio, showed a parameter modification logged on a Saturday afternoon in February with Gareth's approval timestamp applied 6 minutes after the modification was logged, at a time when, according to the building access records I later pulled, nobody had badged into the office. I found this on a routine audit. I almost let it go. The time discrepancy was minor, plausibly explainable by a remote access login, and the modification itself appeared small on its surface, a change to the confidence interval threshold used in the concentration risk calculation. I told myself it was probably an administrative inconsistency. I logged it as a minor flag in my audit notes. I did not yet understand what it actually was. I understood 2 weeks later, when I was running the quarterly model performance review and pulled the output history for HL-ERM-9 across the previous 18 months. The modification made in February had changed how the model calculated the upper tolerance boundary for equity concentration in any single sector. The change was small in percentage terms. In dollar terms, given the size of the portfolios being modeled, it meant that the model was now tolerating significantly higher concentration risk in the energy sector than it had before, without flagging that concentration as an elevated exposure requiring senior review. I went back through the portfolio reports generated after the February modification. The energy sector concentration in the Eastern region's equity portfolios had been growing steadily since January. Under the original model parameters, this concentration would have been flagged as elevated in the March quarterly report. Under the modified parameters, it was not flagged. It was reported as within acceptable limits. I sat at my desk for a long time after understanding this. My coffee went cold. I did not drink it. The implication of what I was looking at was not subtle. Someone had modified a risk model in a way that suppressed a warning signal that should have been visible in the firm's reporting, and they had done it without following the proper documentation and approval procedure. Whether this was negligence or something considerably worse was a question I was not yet positioned to answer, but I knew what it looked like, and what it looked like was wrong. I brought this to Conrad. I want to be clear about the sequence here because it matters. I did not go to Philip Okafor, my direct supervisor. I did not go to compliance. I did not go to HR. I went to Conrad because Conrad was the person I trusted to tell me what I was actually looking at before I did anything that could not be undone. I met him for coffee at a place 3 blocks from the office on a Wednesday morning at 7:30 before either of us went in. I brought my laptop. I showed him everything. The modification log, the access record, the timestamp discrepancy, the parameter change, the portfolio concentration data, the suppressed flagging in the quarterly report. Conrad looked at all of it without speaking. He asked me to go through it again from the beginning. I did. When I finished the second time, he closed my laptop gently and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been hoping for a different answer and has not received it. He said, "How many people know you've found this?" I said, "Just you." He said, "Keep it that way for now." He said, "Do not put anything about this in your work emails." He said, "I need to make some calls." I asked what kind of calls. He looked at me over his pushed-up glasses for a moment. He said, "The kind that need to happen before we decide what to do next." He told me to continue working normally, to complete my regular deliverables, to give no indication that anything had changed. He told me this would take time, and I needed to be patient. I asked him if he thought Gareth was responsible. Conrad was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I think Gareth is involved. Whether he's responsible depends on what we find out about why." Those 2 sentences sat in my head for 4 months, while I waited and worked and watched and added files to the folder on my personal hard drive. The calls Conrad had referred to, I learned later, were to 3 people. The first was to a former colleague named Dennis Faber, who had spent 15 years as a senior examiner at the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority before moving into private consulting. The second was to a securities attorney named Imelda Tran, who worked at a firm in Washington, D.C., and whom Conrad had retained on matters related to regulatory compliance during his tenure as chief risk officer. The third was to an investigator at the SEC's Office of Market Intelligence, a division responsible for evaluating tips and referrals related to potential securities law violations. Conrad made this last call after consulting with Imelda, who had reviewed the documentation I had assembled and provided her initial legal assessment in a memo that Conrad shared with me in a coffee shop 4 weeks after our first meeting. The memo was 12 pages long and was written in the measured, precise language of someone who was being careful because the subject matter requires care. The relevant conclusion, stated in the final paragraph, was this: the pattern of activity described in the supporting documentation is consistent with the deliberate manipulation of internal risk models for the purpose of suppressing material risk disclosures in violation of Regulation SK Item 305, FINRA Rule 4370, and potentially Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. Imelda's memo did not name Gareth Stoll. It described a pattern and noted what that pattern suggested about the behavior of whoever was responsible for the modifications. It was careful and specific, and it made my stomach drop in a way that took several hours to resolve into something I could function alongside. Because what Imelda was describing in the measured language of a securities attorney was fraud. I read that memo on a Saturday morning in April, sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in Arlington, Virginia, with my coffee going cold again because I kept forgetting to drink it. I had been carrying what I knew for 2 months by that point. He had been walking into the office every morning and sitting 20 feet from Gareth Stoll and conducting normal professional interactions with him while knowing what I knew. And I had thought I had made peace with the weight of it. I had not made peace with it. I had just been managing it, and reading Imelda's memo stripped the management layer off entirely and left me sitting alone in my kitchen, understanding that the thing I was in the middle of was not an internal HR matter or a performance issue or even a compliance flag. It was potentially a federal securities violation that had been ongoing for months in a division I worked in, and I was the person who had found it, and I was sitting on it while the SEC began a preliminary evaluation of the information Conrad had provided through the proper channels. I called Conrad that afternoon, and he answered on the first ring, which told me he had been waiting for my call. I said, "How long does this take?" He said, "The right amount of time." I said, "That's not an answer." He said, "I know." He said, "Elliot, you have to trust the process here." I said, "I do trust the process. I'm asking how long it takes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Imelda thinks we're looking at 6 to 10 weeks before any formal action." I said, 6 to 10 weeks. He said, "Yes." He said, "In the meantime, you keep working, you keep your records, you don't talk to anyone at the firm about this, and you let me know if you notice anything else." I said, "Okay." I made fresh coffee. I drank it before it got cold. I went back to work on Monday morning and did not let anything reach my face. The promotion announcement came on a Thursday in the second week of July. I'm 8 weeks after I'd read Imelda's memo, 3 days after Conrad had called me at 10:30 at night and said he needed to tell me something. What he had told me in that late night call was this: the SEC examination had moved from preliminary evaluation to formal investigation. They had issued a document preservation request to Hargrove and Lund 3 days earlier, which meant the firm's legal team was now aware that something was under examination, though the specific focus of the investigation had not yet been disclosed to the firm. What this meant, Conrad explained, was that the timeline had accelerated. It also meant something else that I had not anticipated. Gareth Stoll was not the only person under examination. The investigation had widened. Conrad was careful about how much he told me. Not because Imelda had advised that the integrity of the investigation required limiting my knowledge of its specific scope, but he told me enough. He told me that what the investigators had found went beyond the model modification I had identified. He told me that the energy sector concentration that had been suppressed in the quarterly reports was not accidental and was not the work of one person acting alone. He told me that there were individuals within the firm's senior leadership who had a financial interest in that concentration not being flagged, and that the interest was not an abstract one. I asked him to be specific. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There are investments, personal positions, in the energy sector." That became more valuable as the firm's portfolio concentration in that sector grew without triggering a review. And I sat with that for a long time. Then I said, "That's insider manipulation." He said, "Imelda says it may be. That's why the SEC is involved and not just FINRA." The next day, Philip Okafor called me into his office and told me the firm wanted to promote me to Vice President of Analytics for the Eastern region. I want you to understand what it felt like to be standing in that conference room 3 days after Conrad's late night call with 14 people looking at me and a $94,000 raise materializing in the air between me and the handshake I was being offered. I want you to understand what it felt like because I need you to understand what it cost to do what I did. I had worked for 6 years to be in that room. I had earned every piece of it, honestly, through real work, or through the kind of meticulous attention to detail that is neither glamorous nor easily recognized, but that constitutes the genuine substance of what a financial analytics professional is supposed to do. I had a student loan balance of $41,000 still outstanding from graduate school. I had a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment that cost $2,200 a month. I had parents who were proud of me in the particular way of immigrant parents who measure pride in concrete accomplishments and who would receive the news of a VP promotion with a specific quality of satisfaction that I wanted very much to give them. I was standing in front of a room full of people who were about to applaud for me, and Conrad's hand was on my arm and he was whispering 4 words that were going to cost me something I had spent 6 years building. Resign. Right now. But I stood there for 2 seconds, maybe 3, the length of time it takes to decide something that cannot be undecided. Then I looked at Philip Okafor, and I looked at Deanna Rest, and I looked at Gareth Stoll sitting at the far end of the table with an expression I could not quite read, and I said, "I appreciate this enormously. I want to say with complete sincerity that this firm has given me tremendous professional opportunities and that I valued every one of them. And I'm resigning, effective immediately. The silence that followed was not the silence of a paused movie. It was the silence of 14 people processing something their brains had not been prepared to receive. Kwame's mouth opened slightly. Nadia's eyebrows went up by approximately a centimeter, which on Nadia's face was equivalent to full-body shock. So Philip Okafor's hand, extended toward me for the handshake, remained in the air for 2 full seconds before he pulled it back. Diana Rest's expression did not change, which I would later understand to mean something specific. Gareth Stoll looked at me with an expression I can only describe as calculating, the expression of someone rapidly running scenarios. I set my security badge on the table. I said, "I'll collect my personal effects and be out of the building within the hour." Then I walked out of the conference room, and Conrad followed me. And we both knew that the next several hours were going to determine a significant number of things. We went to Conrad's car, which was parked in the garage 2 blocks from the building. He had a Volvo V90 that smelled like paper and old coffee, and we sat in it in the parking garage with the engine running, and Conrad told me the rest of what he knew. The SEC investigation had found, through the document preservation analysis and through information provided by a source Conrad did not name, that Gareth Stoll had been making the model modifications under direction from 2 senior partners in the firm's investment committee, men named Alistair Fordham and Craig Newell, both of whom sat on the Eastern Region's executive committee and both of whom held undisclosed personal equity positions in 3 energy sector companies whose valuations were materially affected by the concentration of Hargrove and Lund's regional portfolio in that sector. The mechanism was not complicated in concept, though it was sophisticated in execution. Fordham and Newell had personal financial interests that benefited when the firm's portfolio concentrated in certain energy stocks, and they had directed Gareth to modify the risk models in ways that prevented the concentration from triggering the firm's internal review protocols, which would have required disclosure and potential rebalancing that would have moved the market position of those stocks. This was, Imelda had told Conrad in her latest consultation, a textbook violation of FINRA Rule 4120, Section 17A of the Securities Act, and potentially Section 10B of the Exchange Act. It was the kind of thing that ended careers and resulted in substantial prison sentences. Conrad told me why I needed to be out of the building before the formal action happened, however, which the SEC had told Imelda would likely occur that afternoon. If I accepted the VP role, I became part of the formal leadership structure responsible for the analytics division, which meant I became part of the chain of accountability for everything in that division, including the model modifications, including the suppressed risk disclosures, including everything that was about to be formally charged. The promotion, Conrad believed, had been specifically timed to expand the net of accountability. Whether Philip Okafor was complicit in that timing or was himself being used, Conrad wasn't certain. But the effect would have been the same. Elliot Osei Bonsu, newly minted VP of Analytics, would have had his name on 6 months of risk disclosure documents that misrepresented material exposure information. And while I sat in Conrad's Volvo and listened to him explain how thoroughly and precisely I had nearly been ruined, and I thought about my parents in Silver Spring and my loan balance and the badge I'd put on the conference room table and the 2 seconds in which everything had balanced. 2 seconds, that was the margin. The investigators arrived at Hargrove and Lund's Eastern Regional offices at 2:18 in the afternoon, which was approximately 3 hours after I had collected my personal items from my desk, which had consisted of 2 framed photographs, a Georgetown mug, a Leuchtturm notebook I'd been using since February, and the external hard drive on which I kept the HL documentation folder. I had not taken anything belonging to the firm. I had not copied any firm documents, just though I had preserved my own records of the work I had done and the observations I had documented. Imelda had been explicit about this boundary, and I had respected it absolutely. The investigators were a joint team from the SEC's Enforcement Division and the DOJ's Securities and Financial Fraud Unit, led by a senior enforcement attorney named Veronica Huang, who had 22 years of securities enforcement experience, and accompanied by a forensic accounting specialist named Lawrence Obi, who had spent 16 years at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before moving to the DOJ. They arrived with a court-authorized search warrant covering all electronic records, communications, and documents related to the Eastern Region's Investment Analytics Division, the firm's energy sector portfolio holdings, were in the personal financial accounts of Alistair Fordham and Craig Newell. They also had preservation orders covering Gareth Stoll's work devices and access logs. I know all of this because Imelda, who was representing me in an advisory capacity at this point, and who had coordinated my voluntary cooperation with the investigation over the preceding weeks, called me at 2:45 in the afternoon and told me it had begun. I was sitting in Conrad's apartment in Georgetown by that point because Conrad had suggested I not go home immediately in case anyone from the firm attempted to reach me before my attorney was formally engaged. I had a cup of tea I wasn't drinking, and I was looking at Conrad's bookshelves, which were dense and organized in a way that suggested he had a system. He was on the phone in the other room, and I sat there and thought about 6 years and 6 months and 4 months of knowing, and the 2 seconds at the table, and the badge I'd left behind. My formal attorney, separate from Imelda, who was handling the regulatory advisory work, was a man named David Achterberg, who had spent 14 years as a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia before going into private practice. He was referred to me by Conrad's network and had a reputation for being precise, aggressive in the service of his clients' actual interests, as opposed to the performance of those interests, and deeply intolerant of nonsense. He was also, as I discovered when he met me at Conrad's apartment at 4:30 that afternoon, the possessor of a very dry sense of humor that emerged in the form of extremely brief observations delivered with complete deadpan. So he reviewed my documentation folder for 45 minutes while I waited. He asked me 6 questions, 4 of which were about the chain of custody for the records I had kept, because the integrity of my documentation was going to matter considerably. He noted that I had preserved every record in its original form with intact metadata and had added nothing to the files after the dates on which they were created. He said, "That's either very good instincts or you had legal guidance." I said, "I had good instincts, and then I had legal guidance that confirmed them." He said, "Same result." He told me I was in a straightforward position legally because I had found something, reported it through appropriate channels, not participated in the underlying conduct, and resigned before accepting any formal accountability for a division under investigation. He said, "The question is how the firm and the individuals involved characterize your departure, and whether anyone attempts to implicate you in what they did." I asked him how likely that was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Gareth Stoll's attorney called Imelda this afternoon. I asked what that meant. He said, it means Gareth is thinking about what he can offer in exchange for consideration, and the most valuable thing he can offer is whatever he knows about who else was involved." He paused. He said, "You're not on that list, but it's better to be sure." That was the most unsettling sentence I'd heard all day, and I had heard some genuinely unsettling sentences. The news broke publicly on Friday morning, just 16 hours after the investigators had arrived at the firm. The Wall Street Journal ran a story at 6:15 a.m. under the headline, "SEC and DOJ investigating Hargrove and Lund Eastern Region over alleged risk model manipulation." The story named Alastair Fordham and Craig Newell as subjects of the investigation. It did not name Gareth Stoll, which Imelda told me later was because Gareth had, by that point, initiated cooperation discussions with the investigators, and his naming had been temporarily suppressed as part of that process. The story noted that 2 members of the firm's senior leadership had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome. By 8:30 in the morning, the Journal had updated the story with a statement from Hargrove and Lund's communications office expressing full cooperation with authorities and describing the matter as the behavior of individuals acting outside the firm's policies and values, which is the corporate equivalent of discovering your own kitchen is on fire, and issuing a statement about your commitment to fire safety. Bloomberg picked up the story at 9 o'clock. Reuters followed at 9:20. By noon, 3 financial news outlets had mentioned that a senior analyst in the Eastern Region's analytics division had resigned the previous morning under circumstances that, in retrospect, appeared to anticipate the investigation. And while none of them had my name yet, Conrad called to let me know that it was likely only a matter of time. I asked him what he recommended. He said, "Let David and Imelda manage the narrative. Do not speak to journalists. Do not post anything on social media. Do not contact anyone at the firm." I said I understood. He said, "Elliot." I said yes. He said, "You did the right thing. Every step of it." I said I knew. He said, "Sometimes knowing that is the only thing that makes the rest of it bearable." I said, "Is the rest of it bearable?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It gets there. The formal government charges were filed 26 days after the search warrant was executed. The DOJ's Securities and Financial Fraud Unit charged Alastair Fordham and Craig Newell with securities fraud under Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act, wire fraud under 18 U.S.C. 1343, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. The government alleged that Fordham and Newell had, or between October of the previous year and July of the current year, directed the modification of internal risk models to suppress material risk disclosures in the firm's quarterly reports, while simultaneously holding undisclosed personal equity positions valued at approximately $8.3 million in companies whose valuations were positively affected by the concentration of portfolio exposure that the suppressed risk disclosures allowed to grow unreviewed. The wire fraud charges stemmed from internal communications, including emails and encrypted messaging platform records, in which the 2 men explicitly coordinated the model modification strategy and discussed the financial benefit to their personal positions. The conspiracy charge tied them together and to Gareth Stoll Chu, who was named as an unindicted co-conspirator with a cooperation agreement that had been formalized the previous week. David called me when the indictment was unsealed and read the relevant sections over the phone in the same tone someone might use to read the weather. He said, "Your documentation is referenced in the government's factual basis as independently corroborating the modification timeline. That means the investigation was validated, in part, by the records you kept." I said, "I just did the work." He said, "That's the whole story, isn't it?" I said, "I supposed it was." The 3 months that followed the indictment were complicated in ways I had not fully anticipated. The immediate practical reality was that I was unemployed. I had resigned from a position that was, by the standards of my industry and my age, a strong and stable one. And I had done so in a way that was publicly connected to a significant securities fraud investigation, and while the connection was, factually speaking, unambiguously in my favor, the financial services industry has a specific and well-documented relationship with anyone associated with regulatory scrutiny, regardless of the nature of that association. I had interviews for 3 senior analyst positions in which the Hargrove and Lund situation was the central subject of the conversation, in each case framed with diplomatic caution that thinly concealed the real question, which was whether I was a person who generated regulatory attention or a person who responded appropriately to regulatory violations. David advised me to be direct about the latter and let the government's records speak to the former, which was good advice that I followed and which resulted in 2 of the 3 firms declining to move forward and one of them asking for a second conversation. The financial stress of those months was real. I had savings sufficient to cover approximately 5 months of expenses at my normal spending rate, and I reduced my spending rate considerably, and I did not call my parents until I had a clear picture to offer them, because there is a specific quality of parental worry that I did not want to activate in my mother without a resolution attached to the concern. I called Conrad frequently. I went to the gym with a consistency I had never previously managed. I finished the Leuchtturm notebook and started another one. I read 3 books that had been sitting on my shelf for 2 years. I cooked more than I had in a decade. Now, and these are the things you do when you are waiting for a process that is larger than you to complete itself, and you understand that your participation in it is finished, and the only remaining variable is time. The SEC's parallel civil enforcement action against Fordham and Newell was filed 6 weeks after the criminal indictment, alleging the same underlying conduct and seeking disgorgement of the approximately $2.1 million in profits the government had traced directly to trading activity during the period of the model manipulation, along with civil penalties and permanent bars from serving in any senior capacity at any SEC-registered financial firm. The civil action added detail to the government's theory that the criminal indictment had left somewhat compressed, and reading the civil complaint, to which Imelda forwarded to me with a cover note that said simply, "This is thorough. I was struck by the degree to which the documentation I had gathered had contributed to the specificity of the government's timeline." The complaint referenced 18 separate instances of model parameter modifications, 17 of which I had identified in my records, and the one I hadn't had been found by the forensic accountants in the device records seized during the search. My records covered 17 of 18 instances of the core conduct. I had not missed much. Sitting in my kitchen with the civil complaint on my laptop and a cup of coffee, I was actually drinking while it was still warm. I thought about the routine audit review in March, in which I had almost let the first discrepancy go. Almost flagged it as a minor administrative inconsistency. Almost moved on. Almost. The word that separates 2 very different outcomes. The Hargrove and Lund firm itself reached a settlement with the SEC and DOJ in month 4, agreeing to pay $34 million in combined civil penalties and disgorgement, implement comprehensive reforms to its model validation and risk disclosure protocols, and submit to a 2-year monitorship by an independent compliance consultant. The settlement included a detailed findings document that described the failure of internal controls and supervisory structures that had allowed the fraud to proceed for 9 months. It also included, in language that David had negotiated with the government's attorneys with some care, a factual recitation of the role played by a senior analyst who had identified the misconduct through his regular audit responsibilities and had properly escalated his concerns through appropriate channels, resulting in the firm's reporting obligation being fulfilled through that analyst's cooperation with the government's investigation. My name was not in the settlement document. My role was described by function, but the description was accurate and unambiguous, and it was a matter of public record, and David confirmed that any employer conducting due diligence on my background would be able to read that description and understand precisely what had happened. Gareth Stoll received his sentence in month 5 after pleading guilty under the cooperation agreement to 1 count of securities fraud and 1 count of conspiracy. Allen's federal sentencing guidelines for his conduct, mitigated by his cooperation and the government's recommendation, produced a sentence of 27 months in federal prison, a $400,000 fine, and a permanent bar from working in the financial services industry in any capacity. The sentencing hearing was reported briefly in the financial press. I read the brief report and felt something I found difficult to name precisely, which was not satisfaction and was not grief, but was somewhere between those, the specific emotional register of watching a consequence arrive that you knew was coming and that you believed was correct, and that nevertheless costs you something to witness. Because Gareth had been a colleague and a person, and not simply a function in a story about fraud. E. Alastair Fordham and Craig Newell were convicted at trial 7 months after the indictment, following a 3-week proceeding in federal court in the Eastern District of Virginia, during which I testified for 2 days as a fact witness regarding the documentation I had gathered and the model anomalies I had identified. David had prepared me for testimony with a thoroughness that I found both reassuring and slightly exhausting, running me through the examination and anticipated cross-examination over 4 sessions in his conference room until I could describe every document in my folder in precise and consistent terms without embellishment or interpretation beyond what I had actually observed. Testifying was not dramatic in the way that courtroom scenes in films are dramatic. It was precise and methodical and occasionally tedious, and completely unlike anything else I have ever done. The cross-examination attempted 3 times to suggest that my resignation at the exact moment of the promotion announcement was evidence of foreknowledge that implied complicity. David had anticipated this angle and prepared a clean answer. I resigned because my mentor advised me to, based on information he had developed independently over the preceding weeks, and the accuracy of that advice was confirmed by what occurred 3 hours later. The jury convicted on all counts. Fordham received a sentence of 7 years. Newell received a sentence of 6 years. Both were permanently barred from the financial services industry and ordered to disgorge approximately $4.1 million in combined ill-gotten gains. But the position I accepted in month 7 was with the Office of Market Intelligence at the SEC. Imelda had mentioned during one of our consultations that the division sometimes hired experienced financial analysts who had demonstrated specific competencies in identifying irregular patterns in risk reporting, and that my documentation of the Hargrove and Loon situation had been noted positively by people within the division. I applied through the standard process. I was interviewed 3 times over 6 weeks, the last interview being with the division director, a quiet and exceptionally focused woman named Constance Baird, who had spent 8 years in private financial analytics before joining the SEC and who had a way of asking questions that bore a strong resemblance to Conrad's method, just in that the questions were simpler than the information they were designed to surface. She asked me what I thought I was good at. I said, finding what doesn't belong. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, yes. We read the complaint. She offered me the position the following week. The salary was lower than the VP role at Hargrove, and Lund would have been by approximately $31,000 annually. It was, without question, the right job. I called my parents the day the offer letter came. My mother cried, which she rarely does. My father was quiet for a moment and then said, "You did it the right way." That was his highest form of praise, and I received it as such. I called Conrad afterward. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I have a job." He said, "I know." Constance called me. I said, "You've been in contact with her the whole time?" And he said, "I wanted to make sure the right information got to the right person. That's what I do." I said, "Conrad." He said, I said, "Thank you." He said, "You earned it." The same thing he'd said 6 years ago in his office at Hargrove and Lund. The same thing he had meant then and meant now. Some things don't change. The work is the work. You do it correctly the first time. You don't cut corners. You keep your records. And when someone who has spent 61 years doing the same thing grabs your arm in a conference room and whispers 4 words, you listen, because thorough people are thorough for reasons, and the reasons are always worth knowing. The bookcase in my new office at the SEC's Washington field office has 3 shelves. On the bottom shelf, I keep the Leuchtturm notebooks, both of them, filled with the small, precise handwriting I've had since high school. On the middle shelf, I keep the Georgetown mug and the 2 framed photographs. On the top shelf, I keep one thing, a printed copy of the paragraph in the Hargrove and Lund settlement document describing the role of the senior analyst who found what didn't belong. My name isn't in it, but every word of it is mine.